The Handkerchief, written by Gr. 8T78. Harry Potter and the Wizarding World is the sole masterpiece of J.K. Rowling. Chapter 2, Halloween 1991. Turns out Hermione Granger was quite the swot. Draco knew this for many reasons. 1. She tried to answer every question asked in class, much to the amusement of the Slytherins. Draco always laughed along with them. They would notice if he didn't, and besides, it was rather funny. 2. She'd constantly be in the library, it seemed. Granted, he was often there as well. The Hogwarts curriculum was tougher than his home lessons. And there was no way he wasn't getting the top grades of the year. 3. She was a Muggle-born. This was a surprise to Draco, as he expected from her grades and her knowledge in class for her to be steeped in magic from a young age. Considering she'd only learned of her witch status a few months before, she was doing remarkably well in class. 4. And most damning, Draco found himself watching her when he wasn't being careful. He saw that she took copious amounts of notes, hanging on every professor's word. She never needed to glance down at the text when quoting a passage in answer to a professor's question. She was seldom, if ever, wrong in her answers. And every assignment was turned in on time, if not early, her neat script covering the parchment. Usually much longer than the required minimum amount. If he allowed his mind to wander even a bit, he'd without fail come back to himself, finding his chin on his hand, openly staring at her. It was embarrassing. He'd caught Pouncy and Blaze watching him a time or two, but hoped he covered his tracks well enough. One method for covering his tracks was to pick on her housemates. He was still embarrassed about the whole remember-all thing. As he was holding it out, taunting Potter with it as they hovered over the group, he glanced down to find her staring up angrily at him. He'd been hoping to impress her with his superior flying. But apparently he'd failed at being the most talented on a broom once Wonder Boy Scarface showed up. He tossed it high and far then, angry at himself and at the whole situation. He thought he'd had the last laugh when Professor McGonagall stormed out like her hair was on fire, but that hadn't been the case. Of course not. Next, he challenged Potter to a duel, knowing full well that he himself had never even fought so much as a Cornish pixie, much less a human. He counted on Potter have two brain cells to rub together and saying no, but his moron ginger friend jumped in and accepted. No way in hell was he showing up for that. He got them back, though, by sending word to the caretaker Argus Filch through a school elf that the nitwits were out after curfew. Knowing where they'd be, he'd snuck along the trophy room hall to hear them caught, only to overhear Hermione helping them. What the hell? She was risking her standing in the school to help these fools. Didn't she know that was a losing battle, tying herself to the anchor that was Ronald Weasley? Oh. Halloween arrived, one of Draco's favorite holidays. His family often had a party for it, and he was hoping that the festive atmosphere would give him a chance to talk to Hermione casually. Maybe save a little face over the whole remember-all dueling business. Weasley had the crap sense to ruin it by insulting her in charms class that day. It wasn't some big mystery that Hermione was very swotty. Did he need to rub it in so much? She had run off after class, and Draco nearly said something to the git. After all, who treats their housemates that way? She'd gotten them out of that detention with the duel, didn't she deserve some goodwill? As the two houses walked away from the charms classroom, he made an excuse to his friends to double back, walking quietly along the hallway, looking inside empty classrooms in hopes of finding her there. He was nearly about to give up when a small sniffle caught his ear. He turned, finding a tapestry behind which lay a small alcove with a low bench along one side. She sat, her knees drawn up in front of her. She looked up swiftly, hair rising around her shoulders as though it, too, were surprised. "What do you want, Malfoy? Come to finish the job. Got more insults for me?" Her eyes narrowed at him. "What?" "No, Her Granger, I don't." He began, then stopped. He what? What was there to say? "I want to be your friend. I like your hair." Looking at you makes my stomach both hurt and flip around like I'm riding a broom upside down. Real suave, you idiot, he thought. I just wanted to make sure things were good. With you, he answered lamely. Brilliant. Yeah, it looked like things were good, Kit, he thought to himself. I'm fine, Malfoy, just leave me alone, please. She turned her body away from him and sniffled again. Well, if you need anything. What could she possibly need from you, he asked himself. What, was he going to go beat up Weasley? It didn't sound like the worst idea, come to think of it. Tears continued streaming down her face as she looked up at him in confusion. Draco reached in his pocket, finding the folded handkerchief his mother insisted he carry around like a person in the old days. He'd always found the practice ridiculous, although it had come in handy a time or two. He held it out to her silently, meeting her eyes. What, Malfoy? Why, she started. Just take it. It might come in handy. He stuffed the monogrammed square in her hand and backed out of the alcove, hurrying down the hall to the feast. As the night went on and the Halloween feast began, Draco watched the Gryffindor's table as well as he could, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. But she never showed. Once Professor Quirrell showed up and created a panic about a troll, Draco hurried off with the others, a frown marring his features. Where could she have gone? Perhaps she felt so bad after Weasley's rude words and Draco's botched attempt at comfort that she went to bed. Oh. To his surprise, Hermione seemed not just normal, but happy in the days that followed. Apparently, the moronic duo of Potter and Weasley had managed to convince her to become their friend. And suddenly his annoyance towards Weasley and Potter grew to near outright anger. Had he been asked to define it, he'd have sputtered some nonsense about blood traitors like Lucius spoke of when talking about Ron's father at the Ministry of Magic. But in reality, that didn't seem like the biggest deal. There was just this undefinable sense of outrage that the two of them could just become Hermione's friend so easily. Watching her in class during the days that followed, it occurred to Draco that, with the gulf that separated his house from hers, as well as the difference between their blood statuses, the chances that he could simply become Hermione Granger's friend were very slim. Oh. Chapter 3, Who the Hell is Nicholas Flamel and Why Does Anyone Care? Quidditch turned out not to be the distraction that Draco had hoped for. The second match of the year was by far the worst for him, picking a fight with Longbottom and Weasley, and then losing that fight would have been fairly horrendous all on its own. But to do it all just feet away from Hermione had been highly embarrassing. This was made even worse than that by the fact that during the first match between their two houses, he spent more time watching her than watching the match. It was for that reason that he witnessed the first of many surprises from Hermione. When she thought no one was watching, she had snuck away from her friends and snuck into a different section with several of the professors and prefects seated in it. She'd set Professor Snape's robes on fire. It was with complete disbelief that Draco watched as the flames licked higher, finally being put out by Quirrell and Snape himself. What the hell was that? He wondered. Even the anger over losing the match didn't penetrate the fog of his brain. Perhaps she really did belong in Slytherin, he thought. As the Gryffindors celebrated with euphoria and the Slytherins argued their case for a rematch, Draco slipped away from the crowd on the pitch. Noticing a certain bushy-haired someone hurrying off with Scarface and a weasel in tow, he followed at a distance, not wanting to be seen as the trio climbed the steps to Hagrid's hut. Scampering down the hill once they were inside, he hurried round back and pressed himself against the wall near the open window. He had to know what she was thinking. But to his surprise, the topic wasn't about the crazy Quidditch match or even the fire that Hermione had conjured. It was about something being guarded in the school and someone named Nicholas Flamel. As a boy who had spent time in Paris, had taken wizarding history lessons, and who spoke fairly fluent French, Draco had heard the name of Flamel. He remembered as a 9 or 10-year-old reading a bit about him in an old book, but didn't recall much other than his name. He could tell from watching Hermione at dinner However, that she was intrigued by the mystery of the identity of this Flamel. As days went on, she seemed more and more fixated, spending hours in the library searching through biographies. Nothing to do with her actual class work. Surely she would find it soon and move on, Draco thought. But as the Christmas holidays approached, she seemed to be still at a loss. He had messaged his mother back home 2 weeks before, asking for their library's version of 1001 Notable Names in Magical History. Not that he cared about this little quest, of course. It was for his own reading, he assured himself. Colwyn had arrived with the giant tome strapped to his ankle, angrily flapping his wings at Draco as if to ask why he had needed such a heavy book. Draco read the lengthy passage about Flamel, noting the discussion of the Philosopher's Stone. Was this what had gotten them so fixated? What would 3 kids want with a Philosopher's Stone? Sure, it would be great to live forever, he supposed, but it still seemed like a strange and random, not to mention rare and possibly fictional artifact to want. Still, it grated at his nerves to see her so flustered. The night before the Christmas holidays, Draco watched her tear through about 20 books in the library, flipping pages so fast it appeared that her copper eyes were a blur. He could no longer stand it. He moved to the row of the stack she was in, trailing his fingers along the spines of the books on the shelf next to the one at which she was staring intently. Granger, tell me you are not late finishing your history of magic essay, he tisked, looking sidelong at her. In this dim light, her hair seemed to absorb the tiny flickers of torchlight and reflect them back in small curves. Draco found himself wondering if her hair was soft to the touch or coarse. He bet soft. For your information, I am searching for a notable wizard, just for my own knowledge. I turned that essay in weeks ago. Oh, a notable wizard. Perhaps this book then. Draco reached up on the shelf to pull down the library's copy of the very book his owl had brought him. He knew she would have gotten there eventually, but the library was closing very soon, and she was leaving for the holiday tomorrow. And it seemed important to her. No, I think I've already looked in that one, so I don't think, but she broke off, looking more closely at the cover, reading the title. Then she accepted the book graciously, tilting her head to the side in a contemplative way. Thank you, I suppose. I will take a look at it along with these. She placed the book at this top of a short stack on a nearby table, stacking another 5 books on top of it and starting to gather them in her arms. But before she picked them up, she turned to him as though remembering something. Oh, I have. She reached into the cuff of her sleeve, pulling out a familiar white square of fabric, the tiny green initials DM barely visible in the torchlight. She held it out to him with a half smile, looking down with suddenly pink cheeks. You keep it, he said, holding up his hand to stop her as she reached out with it. The tips of his fingers grazed her knuckles for just a moment, and a jolt of static electricity traveled up his arm and into his shoulder. His breath had caught in his throat when she'd taken out the handkerchief. It had been almost 2 months. Had she carried it around all that time, waiting to have the chance to return it? You never know when you might need one, right? He asked. His own cheeks had started burning a soft shade of pink as well. He coughed slightly, then raised his eyes quickly to see her eyes dash away just as they met his. On the whole, it appeared that she was just as uncomfortable as he was, and for that small commonality, he was grateful. Oh. Chapter 4. Tetris. The Christmas holidays in 1991 were a quiet affair at the manor, with the notable exception of his mother's New Year's Eve gala. Draco stood baldly in his nicest robes near the enchanted orchestra, wondering when this night might finally end and he could get upstairs to his room. Blaze had introduced him to an interesting bit of Muggle technology that he quite enjoyed, something he had gotten for his birthday from his Muggle side of the family. A small gray rectangle with a smaller green square upon it and several buttons on its surface seemed to provide him with hours of fun. Slide a button near the top, and the box came to life, little shapes on the green square dropping down slowly to form lines which then disappeared. You could use the buttons to position the shapes however you would like. The object was to get as many lines as possible. For several days, Draco had gotten into the range of 90 or so lines before the game ended, and he was sure that very soon he'd crack 100 lines. Blaze had shown him a simple spell to power the box so that he did not need to charge the battery inside, whatever that meant. Draco was fairly certain there were no actual bats living inside the box, but with Muggle things, you could never be entirely sure of anything. He supposed. His gaze fell upon the dancers waltzing nearby. Marable Bulstrode lumbered by in the tightest orange dress robes he'd ever seen, pushed deftly around the room by his own father. Father and son caught eyes for a moment, and Lucius's lips thinned momentarily as if to say, "When we must, we must." Stiff upper lip and all of that. Mr. Bulstrode was a solicitor and Mrs. Bulstrode organized some sort of charity organization that his mother helped with on occasion. Draco shuddered to think of his own future, dancing with frightfully boring witches who stank of heavy French perfume. He'd much rather dance with. His mind flashed a picture in his head so quickly it took him by surprise. Why would he want to dance with Hermione Granger, of all people? She was not a pureblood, not even very pretty with that seemingly sentient cloud of hair following her around. Her teeth were too big and her eyes were too much like copper and her lips were too pink, and when she smiled, her face lit up like she'd just shared a secret, and… No. That was stupid. She was smart, that was all. She was intelligent and interesting to talk to sometimes. She was smarter than most of the people in Hogwarts, some 7th years included. Too smart to hang around with the jerks with whom she kept company. Too nice to be in Slytherin. His mind drifted to her recent flame obsession, and he reminded himself to ask his father about this Philosopher's Stone business the next day. Oh. Yes, I have heard of a Philosopher's Stone. It supposedly offers everlasting life to the one who possesses it. Are you working on some history of magic project? Lucius asked idly. He pressed a hand over his eyes in an attempt to push away the headache he often got on New Year's Day. To Draco, it seemed as though he did not wish to have this conversation. Yes, just something I'm working on in school. This was technically correct, so Draco felt no compunction about misleading his father. It seems like quite a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. Draco imagined Weasley wielding this kind of power, and he didn't like it. Why were they wanting this stone anyway? Yes, well, eternal life is something that fascinates a great many wizards, you know. I still remember the stories my father Braxus would tell of his grandfather Olivier. He tried all kinds of potions and herbal remedies to prolong his life. It must have worked for something. He was, I believe, 168 years old when he died. Father said he was an ornery old shit though. Lucius laughed and then winced, sipping his watered-down fire whiskey that he used to stave off a bad hangover. There was a moment of silence before he continued. And of course, you know my mentor Lord Voldemort, these last 2 words, Lucius whispered reverently. He spoke many times of wishing to have eternal life before he died. If only he had succeeded, Draco, the world could be a very different place now. We would have had the right people in power, the right things being taught at Hogwarts. None of this letting in mudbloods nonsense. The natural order would have been restored to the wizarding world, and it would have been highly beneficial to all of us who served him. To Draco, none of that sounded good. He didn't know much about this Voldemort fellow other than the bits and pieces his father had shared over the years. But in general, he didn't sound great to be around. After all, Potter was an absolute git, but why did Lord Voldemort kill his parents in the first place? And theirs weren't the only deaths that the man seemed to be responsible for. Draco had once overheard his father discussing some people named Prewett and others named McKinnon with his friends. Curious, he had gone into the Malfoy Manor library and searched for the names. There were articles from years ago detailing the gruesome deaths of families with these names, only months apart, with mentions of a person they had termed he who must not be named being connected to the deaths. It had not taken Draco long to determine that this was Lord Voldemort. What was his father's obsession with this man? Do you have many mudbloods in your classes? His father suddenly asked, and it was Draco's turn to feel a bit ill at ease with the conversation. Yes, a few. Draco made as if to stand up and go, but his father raised a hand from across his large desk as if to push him back into the seat. And are they as stupid and as brainless as expected? Lucius smirked. Yes, well, all but one. There is one who's doing very well, uncommonly well with the classes in fact. The word slipped out so quickly, and Draco willed himself to shut up. But surely he is not besting you. Lucius's smirk widened into a sneer. It's a girl, actually. A witch. Draco coughed. Lucius's look of disgust and distaste was evident. Well, so Dumbledore says. For all we know, she is just a stupid muggle who lucked her way into Hogwarts. Draco cleared his throat in a way that he hoped sounded like agreement to his father. Yes. Well, she's very good. In classes, he finished firmly. Did his father really believe they'd let an actual muggle attend Hogwarts? Still, I'm certain she's no match for you. Lucius smiled in a way that was somehow both endearing and threatening. I'm sure, Draco said effusively. He hurried out of his father's study and returned to the science suite upstairs. He most certainly was not sure that Hermione Granger was no match for him. In fact, he would almost bet that Hermione held the top grade in most if not all of their classes. But there was still months to go before that was a concern. Oh. It was an hour or so later, as Draco lay on his bed playing the little game, that something clicked in his brain. The Philosopher's Stone gave eternal life. Lord Voldemort had wanted eternal life. Potter had faced off against Lord Voldemort 10 years ago. Now Potter was searching for the stone. What if Potter and his friends weren't looking for eternal life for themselves, but was looking to keep it away from someone else? No. Lord Voldemort was dead. His father had said so. The Daily Prophet had said so. Surely they knew best. And yet, the man had once wanted to gain eternal life. What if he was still alive and still looking for a way? Like a Philosopher's Stone. No. Draco leaned back and closed his eyes, hearing the tinny musical sounds of his game round ending in defeat, but not caring. Oh,